Hello everybody, and welcome to the Factory of the Future webinar series by SYSPRO. I'm Roger Landman, Head of Product Management at SYSPRO, and on today's episode we're going to take a closer look at the inner workings of the fabricated metals industry. Alongside me I have Joe Velez, Managing Director of Ultra Consultants, a consultancy that assists businesses in transforming their processes and selecting the correct solution for their future state requirements and challenges. Joe has tremendous amounts of knowledge in manufacturing and is going to give us a lot of valuable insights based upon his experience on how the fabricated metals industry can evolve to meet the factory of the future. We'll look at this topic by analyzing the current situation, then looking at what the future looks like for the industry, and then finally how fabricated metals manufacturers can build a sustainable business. Looking at the current situation. The fabricated metals industry is generally a low-margin industry and highly competitive, with many businesses looking to get to the lucrative deals. The industry experienced a shift from oversupply to the current worldwide shortage, which has impacted raw materials, inbound logistics, the factory floor, and the outbound warehouse. Metal prices are dictated by the London Metal Exchange, so not too much leverage for better prices. China consumes about 50% of all the steel available in their value-added process. According to a recent SYSPRO research, 82% of fabricated metal businesses have experienced supply chain and material handling disruptions, further eating into those diminishing margins. With the volatile markets, offshore price cutting, and increasing customer demands for quality, speed and customization, metal fabricators have had to become more innovative and adopt technology solutions to maintain competitive advantage. As someone who spends a lot of time in industry, and this industry specifically, what have you seen as the main challenges for the metal fabricators, Joe?
Thank you, Roger. Pleasure to be with you today. Let me start by saying, recently Industry Week did a study showing that 49% of the companies surveyed were looking at technology investments, but what they were seeking was better analytics and secure connectivity. However, that was before COVID, and since COVID, the same studies are finding that folks have shifted a little bit to trying to deal with some of the pain points they have in the supply chain. So let's get specific about some of those pain points that we're seeing. Replenishment risk for raw materials. Because supply chain disruptions have occurred, it's exposed less than adequate inventory management policies. And so those replenishment risks require a different way of thinking, a different way of managing their supply chain. And so that's one pain point. Leading to stockouts and customer disruption. Another pain point is the need for internal process improvement, finding themselves stagnant and not improving their internal processes or their supplier integration processes. And that is an area that we see metal fabricators spending a lot of time on. They're beginning to recognize that their internal process flows need to be improved, their metal flow, their information flow, their decision points, the agility that they have in their process flow in general is a pain point. Another pain point is the length of supply chain. They're trying to shorten supply chains. When you have disruptions, it's a lot less costly if your supply chain isn't a very long supply chain. This is why we're seeing new distribution centers popping up all over in the United States, all over the country, and I think this is true all over, where folks are now willing to invest in inventory and supply chain in the distribution centers, or also internally, as a way to protect themselves. You can try to lean the supply chain and not have that protection, but when a disruption occurs, it hurts the bottom line. There's also another pain point in logistics. Again, lack of supply chain visibility, lack of best practices in how to manage a warehouse, how to manage the transportation function. All of those are pain points that we're starting to see, and metal fabricators historically haven't invested a lot in warehouse practices. So this is an area we're starting to see. And then another pain point is lack of visibility in the supply chain. Again, with these longer supply contracts that metal fabricators tend to have, for their raw materials, their sourcing is pretty much locked in, but their visibility to that sourcing is not. So whether it's their raw material or their maintenance and repair and operational tactical needs, supporting material supplies, the disruption in those can be very, very costly. And so making certain they have visibility to the status of that is key. And so you see a lot of folks addressing this by seeking better analytics or better visibility. One thing I would add too is a pain point to try to insulate themselves against volatile prices. You mentioned the London Metal Exchange. Some of the leading practice metal producers actually have hedging strategies, and they hedge in order to protect their metal and give themselves stability. Last thing I'd say is that we're seeing metal fabricators that are growing by acquisition. One of their high priorities is being able to propagate what they consider to be their best practices to the acquired entity. And when they can't do that in the face of lack of integration or lack of skill set, whatever it might be, we're seeing that as a pain point also, where they're asking for help in those areas.
Thanks, Joe. Some key trends that we've noticed over the last 2 to 3 years that are affecting the industry and shaping the future are: trend number 1, reshoring. And this seems to be the first trend that everybody picks up: the move back to where the work was originally undertaken and sent offshore. The benefits of offshoring for cheaper labor and raw materials has been negated by salaries in the Near and Far East increasing significantly. Trend number 2, automation. Now, automation isn't necessarily a new trend, but its adoption is accelerating in response to the difficulties many metal fabrication companies have in recruiting skilled labor. Where previously there were concerns about losing jobs, this is reversed and is now welcomed as a way to improve working conditions, streamline efficiencies, and support their role rather than compete for it. Trend number 3, and this is agile environments. Prior to the pandemic, many organizations adopted agile and lean by implementing just-in-time manufacturing. This led to businesses minimizing inventory and cutting costs to adapt to the changing market and to try and become competitive. When supply chain shortages became the norm, some manufacturers were left without materials to make their products. And I'll pick this up specifically a bit more later. Trend number 4 is cybersecurity. To remain agile, metal fabrication facilities rely on multiple systems and a hyper-connected workforce. Automation, enterprise resource planning systems, various software offerings and applications, communication platforms, customer portals, and other cloud computing capabilities are all critical to this success. But they are all subject to cyber threats. Now, growth is forecast for the next 10 years in this industry, but it may result in the correctly prepared and positioned businesses growing at a rate much more than the rest of the community and taking the lion's share, while the rest of the businesses find themselves with low growth rates or even stagnating. So we'll need to unpack what the fabricated metals factory of the future will actually look like to survive the current environment and join the high growth stream. Now, interestingly, SYSPRO research shows that 65% of businesses in the fabricated metals industry looked into building a digital strategy to address the ongoing supply chain disruptions and internal operations interruptions. Joe, would you like to elaborate around the disconnect between strategy and execution and how the digital transformation doesn't seem to be a priority at present with some businesses?
Yeah, they're all aligned. Okay, there is a disconnect between strategy and execution because tools make the difference and the philosophy makes the difference. So metal fabricators, in order to succeed, they succeed on the basis of quality and timeliness of their raw materials. If they don't have a good strategy for supply and a digital strategy for supply, then they're going to interrupt those, possibly getting material that is lesser quality or material that's good quality but late. So these inputs are critical longer-term supply requirements, and they're baked into longer-term supply contracts. So those don't change significantly month to month or year to year. We're also seeing, of course, steel mills and aluminum smelting operations are slow to be built, slow to emerge. So just because of the high cost of entry. So supply base is fairly stable and exists on a global scale. Fabricators tend to have very stable or long-term arrangements with those sources. But once again, the performance of the supply chain, just because it's configured for the longer term, doesn't mean it's performing to within the customer service requirements that you have. And that is where we see the rub. So when you think about basic raw material flow, all supply needs can benefit from global sourcing, from metal fabricators that realize this disconnect.
Oh, thanks, Joe. That was really, really valuable. I must say this did leave us rather confused at times as well. Most of the customers surveyed in the previous SYSPRO survey highlighted the need to be closer to the customer to improve the customer experience. The digital transformation is a key enabler for this to take place, and yet on this latest survey, most highlighted that they were focusing on investing to improve internal operations, with very few highlighting that they needed better visibility along the supply chain. I recently read some very interesting literature about the new concept of a global value chain and the use of specialist best-of-breed component manufacturers, no matter where they are in the world, to ensure that the final product is the best and most cost-effective. Now, we've covered some of this in your response earlier, but how does this align with what you've seen in your interactions with the industry?
Well, once again, I mentioned this earlier, but when I'm interacting with the industry, one of the things that they recognize is that their global supply chains have risk that they never had to manage before. And while they have long-term supply contract, that risk has to do with their own suppliers or their own labor force being able to supply a client's demand for metal, raw material demand. So when you think about metal, longer-term contracts don't necessarily guarantee good service. And so one of the things we've seen is that those best-of-breed manufacturers, they need the cost-effective supply chains, but they need visibility as well. And then for the pieces that are not metal, because you can't just rely on metal supply, there's many other materials required to make operations flow. That's where the biggest opportunity tends to lie, to maintain that visibility. And the mills and the metal fabricators that realize this are the ones that are out in front leading the industry.
Thanks, Joe. Again, a very valuable insight. So mixing the present and the future, let's talk about Industry 4.0 versus the digital transformation. Everyone has been reading in the media about both of these concepts, and understanding seems to differ. Industry 4.0 is described as the processing of internal data, where the digital transformation is often seen as the improved transparency and reimagining of the supply chain, with the data being processed, being sourced externally along the supply chain. Joe, do you think that these are competing initiatives, or are they complementary? Where should investment go? Our research indicated the digital transformation, yet it was being spent predominantly on internal processes.
I would say that they're not competing initiatives. When they become competing initiatives is when companies do not define a broad business strategy for how they're going to improve their market competitiveness. And that should really drive everything. That may require internal improvement as well as external improvement. So then you have Industry 4.0 and digital transformation as both enablers to driving the business strategy. Okay, because these are highly interconnected. For an effective transformation to happen, both are required. The value proposition is what drives it all. Keep that in mind. Value proposition is what drives it all. And the value proposition may say that a client might want to be the most effective manufacturer, or have high growth, or the most integrated supply chain with the lowest inventory, which makes them efficient. So it depends on how they want to compete in the marketplace. But viewing digital transformation and Industry 4.0 as competing would be the wrong mental model, I would say.
So would you then suggest that the business tackles both together in a coordinated manner, i.e., start with a digital strategy, build out a roadmap to tackle the priority items, and then systematically build the factory of the future? Or should they do a huge internal effort to get operations aligned and then look externally? What are your thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, I always see success when clients start with a transformation roadmap, that they decide what it is that required. They need to have some kind of a management process and develop a transformation roadmap that's going to guide their business. You can't define strategy in the absence of that. Now, once you do that, then that tells you where you want to go. The reality is you'll do some external things that are more urgent than more strategic things internally, and then you'll do some external digital transformation elements as well. In every case, you want to make certain that you're not taking on more than what your organization can do. And so the very strong recommendation there that we give clients is crawl, walk, run. Make sure you understand what your value proposition is, have a transformation roadmap that gets you to that value proposition, and pace it so that your organization can keep up.
Thanks, Joe. Going back to one of our main topics that I mentioned above, and the opinions that we have seen around how lean is to blame for supply chain disruptions. When I look at the analysis, I believe the blame does not lie with lean. Lean does not encourage bare bones inventories, but recommends keeping a reserve of critical components and materials strategically placed along the supply chain to enable manufacturers to weather exactly this kind of supply chain disruption and to still continue operating. My understanding of lean is that it will optimize the supply chain and save significant amounts of money. Personally, implementing lean into a few global supply chains, I've had great success sticking to the principles of lean. One successful implementation was the simply utilizing Kanban along the supply chain and then bringing in cellular manufacture and sequencing into the supplier processes. It was obviously first mapped out with a value stream map. So what is ultra seen in the fabricated metal space related to this? Is the blaming of lean a fair assessment, or is there more to this? What are your thoughts, Joe?
I don't see lean being blamed, although I will tell you that I've run into situations where frustrations exist. Sometimes metal fabrication leaders lack the ability to see beyond what they're currently doing to how they might transform. And that is more of a deeper root cause for their lack of success. When they do lean, in some cases, there's a tendency to do a tools first mentality. So if I put this tool in place or that tool in place, then I'm doing lean. Lean is much bigger than that. It's more of a basic operating system for how everything is done in an enterprise. And when people understand that, they realize that they're missing the larger benefit that can come from it. Now here in the last year or so, sort of post-pandemic, we're seeing companies use distribution centers more. We're seeing inventory management trends improving or skilling up, if you will. And everything that they're doing is intended to protect the customer flow. But ultimately, if you put in inventory, but the workers that are working in your system or the processes you use to calculate replenishments are not correct and are not leaned out, it's not going to be effective for the customer. So there's got to be a little bit more of a foundational shift in what's going on. So no, they're not competing initiatives. In fact, they're interconnected in that the most effective transformations come when there's a holistic view of the future state supply chain that's not limited by internal or external perspectives. You collect data across the enterprise, across the supply chain. You map across the enterprise, across the supply chain, and you let it drive your operational strategy. They do seek, this. No, you got to keep in mind that most metal fab companies do seek to transform their supply chain. Yet most of them have a touch time that's less than 15%. So if they want to reduce inventory, they need to get better utilization and better flow within their operations. But you don't see, we're tending not to see them having much effort in that area. That's a great example of the lean, the larger scope lean transformation initiative, not necessarily being catered to. So notice how we've now drifted away from this external internal paradigm to more of a one paradigm for enterprise transformation, for process flow, for process transformation, enabled by lean thinking and lean techniques.
My thoughts exactly. Thanks, Joe. So let's take a look at how the business can build the factory of the future and compete for the future. And what is this new business and how will it look? So the obvious question at this time is, how does a fabricated metals business create a competitive advantage for themselves to ensure that they have a sustainable business going forward into the future? If we look specifically at a digital transformation and what it entails, we can see a clear route to begin with. The first step would be to understand what will be required to survive in the changing market and where the business will need to go to cut out its niche. This would best be served by a digital strategy to align the business and its initiatives. Once we have this, the next step would be to secure the supply chain, and this would include end-to-end visibility along the entire supply chain. The extended visibility, though, will require a digital platform to collect the data and view it. The digital transformation that we refer to above. Once the supply chain is visible, then it will become time to analyze and identify the bottlenecks in the process, especially internally, as those you can influence. This would be the Industry 4.0 initiative that we referred to above, with the typical production data being moved from analog to digital. Finally, a robust analytics package will be required to analyze all of the data collected and to create the necessary information and knowledge. And this is what we are seeing as mentioned earlier. Any key steps that you would like to add to this, Joe? Have we perhaps missed something out?
No, I think you're on the right track there. Just underscoring the need to have that transformational understanding in the latest thinking of how to leverage the latest thought process, the latest technology, what the people's skill sets are. Process flow is going to be important. I talked earlier about touch time. Needing to understand why material is not flowing through is key, especially in businesses that have slim margins, like in the metal businesses. So there are techniques for understanding that flow and operating on that. I think you're on the right track for that. And the last thing I'd say is obviously the value chain, closing gaps, dealing with threats in the marketplace, driving the market, and taking opportunities to create the value proposition. I think that's key as well. So there's an on-the-floor improvement cycle to get the flow going and make sure things are running to value. And there's kind of a more strategic and off-the-floor set of actions that take you outside the immediate supply chain to what your presence is in the marketplace.
Thanks for that insight, Joe. And finally, let's have a brief look at an ERP system and how it would provide a competitive advantage to a fabricated metals business. The digital strategy will be encapsulated within the business. Some businesses are very high-tech by choice and some very non-technical. The level of technology within the business will also set the tone for what the digital strategy will encompass. Without an ERP, or at least some type of integrated software, the business will be struggling to make this transition and work out where its niche is. So the ERP already captures a lot of useful data and can become the ideal platform to integrate all of the business's disparate software together and consolidate the data for analysis. A really useful part of using your ERP as the basis of your digital transformation is the integration of these systems that will allow all of the relevant data to be stored in the ERP database. This makes the analysis very meaningful, as the analysis can be undertaken in real time. The shared database also means that many different data points can be compared. With integration across the business, including the data collected from the internal machines, the knowledge will be much richer as there are more data points to compare. I know you will have far more exposure to this, Joe, especially on the analytics side. Any comments that you'd like to add based on your experience?
I would. ERP is more of an enabler to the transformation than the basis of it. And so the the struggle I see companies tend to have is using a new ERP system to just duplicate their old system, their old thinking, their old processes, without any new leading practice process simplification, leading practices, process automations. So when they're done, they get their old processes functioning in a new system. And that will not deliver the benefits that they're after. And that winds up providing for frustration. And maybe they blame the tool and didn't really take on a transformative experience with them. I'll say about analytics, new analytics can help detect issues with underlying processes. And if we use that detection to launch problem solving to the root cause, then they can indirectly bring a lot of value. But in and of themselves, analytics are not going to drive transformation if there's not a system in place to detect, react, and close the gaps that are identified by the analytics systems.
Thank you, Joe. That was again very, very insightful. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for joining us and listening in. Joe, it was really a pleasure to discuss these topics with you. Thank you very much for taking some of your valuable time out of your day to be with us. Just as a reminder, my guest today is Managing Director Joe Velez of Ultra Consultants.
Thank you for having me, and we appreciate the chance to be with you and discuss these important topics.
Joe, once again, thank you very much for your time.